On Yom Hamishi, we mentioned that we're going to go on in our introduction to Kodshim, and we're going to take a look at the introduction of this sefer, which is called Nefesh Tov, from the Rosh Hashiva of Chevron, Rav Shlomo Katz. And the question here is about the concept in Kodshim called Shalol Lishma. The Mishnah establishes at the beginning of Masechta Zvachim that if the Kohen had a machshav of Shalol Lishma, then the korban is kosher, but eino ola l'bayla l'shem chova. So that means if Reuven is chayav a korban and the Kohen had a machshav of Shalol Lishma, Reuven is going to have to replace the korban with a second korban. But this korban itself, that was shechted Shalol Lishma, is kosher. And Rashi, at the very beginning of Masechta Zvachim, says that what is Shalol Lishma? It's a case where he had a korban ola and he shechted it l'shem shlom. And the question that we want to ask here is, why does Rashi have to confuse us and complicate the situation by adding another element to the equation, namely that the Kohen shechted it l'shem shlom? Forget about l'shem shlom. Let's just say in the absence of a positive kavanah, l'shem ola, there's no lishma. Why does Rashi feel compelled to add that he had in mind l'shem shlom? Maybe he's a jughead, so to speak. Remember that phrase? He had nothing in his mind. He says, "Amaylo pirish Rashi kipshuto shalol lishma hainu shalo shachat l'shem ola." That's all Rashi had to say. Kol hamosif goreh. Rashi could have said shalo shachat l'shem ola. Maybe he had a blank. His mind was blank. He went blank. What's the l'shem shlom? Now, the Brisker Rav, Zichron Livracha, Rav Yitzchak Zev Halevi Soloveitchik, wrote, as you know, a major treatise on the Rambam. And in the 4th chapter of Hilchos Maisa Karbonos, he presents the following breakthrough thesis. He says there are 2 dinim in Lishma with regard to Karbonos. One is the din that you have to have a akrava lishma. And we find that to some extent common. It's not absolutely unheard of. We have lishma in get. We have lishma in Sefer Torah. There are many dinim that require lishma. And Kodshim and hakravas hakohen is no different. But then there's a second halach. And that is that there's something called a davar haposel. And this is a unique halacha to Kodshim. Elsewhere, either you have it or you don't have it. Meaning, in order to have a hechsher, a kiddush, let's say in Sefer Torah, you need lishma. And that's a requirement. For the get to be kosher, you need lishma. In Kodshim, there's a new halacha called a psul of shalol lishma. V'zeu din mechudash bekodshim sheyesh behem psulei machshava. And we'll see there's a machshavas pigul in Kodshim, there's a machshavas nosar in Kodshim, and also there's a machshava of shalol lishma. It's like a maisa posel. Just like pigul, it's possible because of its status as pigul. Or let's say a balmum, right? The animal has a blemish. That's a davar posel. And now there's a new chiddush in Kodshim that we don't find elsewhere, that a machshava shalol lishma is a machshava poselis. And again, we're going to try to see what is the nafkamina? What difference does it make whether you tell me that a carbon is not kosher, or if you tell me it's a davar aposel? In other words, again, we're back to square one. And that is, why didn't Rashi just complacently write that he didn't have a machshava l'shem olah, and Kodshim requires machshava l'shma? Why did Rashi feel compelled to add that he had a machshava l'shem shlamim? He didn't have a machshava l'shem olah. It's not kosher. Ella, what? Rashi wants to set up a davar aposel, a machshava of shalom l'shma haposelis. Very abstract. What does it mean? And if you read the Rambam carefully, the Rambam actually has a list of 3 machshavos, which are machshavos haposlos. And one is shini makom, the other is shini zman, and then the shini Hashem. Shini Hashem means instead of l'shem olah, he had in mind l'shem chatos, l'shem shlamim. So we see clearly that a machshav of shini Hashem, right, instead of olah shlamim, is a chalos psul machshav. And the Rambam has it as 3 categories, 3 examples of a psul machshav, and those include shinui of makom, shinui of zman, and also shinui Hashem. My nafkamin. Who cares whether it's the absence of a davar machshir, a condition that is required for hechsher, or if it's a davar aposel? Ishochet shalom l'shma, avi psul mishum chisaron shchita l'shma, kamo kol dvarim shetzrichim l'shma, in kain lo avi mitzvah elo bi otza avoda bilvad. V'im kibel mitzas hadam shelo l'shma v'yesh dam nefesh yachzir mi'kabel v'kodshim v'chol hakol lo nifsa. It was only a chisaron l'shma. Now we go back and take dam and replace the dam with other dam. Avol, now that we're saying that there's machshava shelo l'shma, which is machshava poseles, is that passes the entire carbon? Therefore, he doesn't have to have the possibility of going back to the tzavar and collecting a replacement dam. So let's understand. If, let's say, I'll give you the following scenario. The Kohen shechts a carbon, and somehow the mizrach for Kabbalas Hadam wasn't available, and the dam, was nizrak, and it fell on the ritzvas azor. Is it ball game over? No. He can go back to the tzav of the behemoth. If there's still dam hanefesh that's still coming out, he can now replace the first dam and implement the zrika with the replacement dam. Why? Because there's no psul in the carbon. The carbon, the animal per se, has got everything it needs. It's just the dam, which we need for zrika, is unfortunately possible because it's on the ritzvah. But if we can find dam from this behemoth, we'll go ahead and we machshir the carbon. And if machsheva shelo l'shma, he didn't have in mind the shem olah, is a chisaron of hechsher, it just is lacking. And you know what? Go back to the tzara behemoth. If you're lucky, you'll find some dam hanefesh, and go ahead and do his rika with the dam hanefesh. Eretz says no, it's not going to work. Why? Because there's a psul in the gufa shel carbon. It's as if the carbon itself became a baal mum. And why is that? Because the machshava of shelo l'shma is a machshava poselis. And Rashi says if his mind was empty and he didn't think the Kohen had no machshava whatsoever, then the carbon is not possible. It's lacking the hechsher of l'shma, but he can go back, and if he's lucky, he can still collect the dam from the tzavar and now get it right and do it l'shma. But if he has a machshava l'shem Shlomim means Shinui Hashem, that generates a psul in the gufa shel karma. Like any machshava poselos, like nosar, like pigul. And therefore, Rashi adds this point that not only was he missing a piece of the puzzle, he forgot to think l'shem oh, but in addition, he passed the curve. Why? He had in mind the same shlim. That is imachshava. And now he quotes a Gemara at the beginning of Zvachim, in the paragraph that starts Ayin Sham, that Kodshim mechalim Kodshim, the ein chulin mechalim Kodshim. Gabi shinui bailim. Yalfinu lo mikra deino posel elim chashav l'shem mi shemachuyev kapara kimosa. Yinei the machshava shalo l'shma v'rach chisarim b'din l'shma. Ma chiluk yesh bein im chashav l'shem chulin or l'shem kodshim. Gemara makes a distinction. What was his machshav? He had a machshav l'shem chulin, or he had a machshav l'shem another kodshim. And that means that if he had in mind l'shem chulin, then ein chulin mechalim kodshim, which means that his machshav l'shem chulin does not undermine and invalidate the karma. Masha Enken, in a case of shalolishma, it's not just that he had in mind l'shem chulin, but he had in mind a different kodesh. That's already Shini Hashem. That changes the whole nature of this operation. Now, tomorrow, Mr. Hashem, I'm hoping that we will have, which I'm trying to get access to, the Mesifta on Zvachim and its introduction, and maybe even the Mesifta on Menachos. But in the meantime, I happen to have in front of me, here in the Amic Learning Center, the Masechta Yoma of the Art Scroll. And in fact, he has an introduction, which might be a review for us of the Avodas Yom Kippur. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about here. He says the following, that there are two groups of korbanos, two categories that are brought on Yom Kippur. And one of them has to do with the Kohen Gadol going into the Kodesh Kadosh. The other, like for example, the Musaf, that can be done outside the Kodesh Kadosh. The Tamid, which is brought every day of the year, Boker and Bein Arbayim, also is brought on Yom Kippur, and that's out of the Kodesh Kadosh. Now, in four animals, in the case of four animals, there is some association with the Kodesh Kadosh. Two of them were Kodshim, were Karbonis Tzibur, and two were Karbonis Yachid. The Karbonis Yachid, required by the Kohen Gadol, are the par and the ayil. The bull, which is a Karban Chatos, and the ayil, which is a Karban Olo. And he says the following. The par, even though it was an inner par Chatos, and the avodah of the karban was done outside, but it's an inner chatos. Very paradoxical. What makes the paro shel kohen into an avodas pnim when all the avodas hakarbonis are done bibachutz in the azor? And the answer is Hazas Hadam. Why do we classify the Paro Shel Kohen as a Chatos Pnimis, Pnimis meaning in this category, in this context, the Kodesh Kodshim? Because there was Hazas Hadam of the Paro Shel Kohen in the Kodesh Kodshim and also in the Heichal. So the Kohen does smicha on the par, and he recites vidui. First vidui on his own behalf, and then vidui on behalf of his fellow Kohanim. So this is a case of a chatos pnimis. That's a carbon yachid. And what makes it pnimis? The fact that the hazah has to take place inside the Kodesh. Now the olah, which is an ayil, is more or less the same standard olah like any other olah. Whereas the chatos is unique, that it has the status or the requirement of hazah lifnai v'lifnai. So now we have two karbonos of the Kohen Gadol, which are karbonos yachid, and now we want to go on to two karbonos that are karbonos tzibur. He says that karbonos tzibur are associated with this avodas pnim with regard to two he-goats, two se'irim. And the Kohen Gadol does la grola that we spoke about at great length. One of these two se'irim, they were identical, would be designated Lashem, and the other Lazaz. Now again, the dam of the chatos, in this case, we're talking about the se'ir Lashem l'chatos, which is a carbon tzibur, is now going to require hazah in the Kodesh Kadosh. He writes, the Kohen Gadol drew lots over the goats and thereby designated one of them to be offered as a chatos pnimis and the other as a goat for azazah. The dam of the chatos was sprinkled inside the Kodesh Kodshim on this holy day, like the blood of the Kohen Gadol's bull. Now, he says the blood of the chatos, which is the paro shel, right? So now we're talking about the soyer, and he says that the same halach of hazah applies also to the dam hasoyer. The Kohen Gadol leaned on the Azazel goat, recited confession for the sins of the entire nation, and then sent it off to the wilderness. And now we get up to Musaf. Yom Kippur Musaf was number one, a par, number two, an ayil, number three, Shiva Kvasim. And the Shiva Kvasim and the ayil were offered as olos, and the soyer was offered as a chatos. Now, here's how he describes the blow-by-blow calendar, so to speak, or diary of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. At midnight, the process of preparing the Mizbeach for the day's service was begun. The ash was separated from the altar. So this is called in the Gemara's language Truma Sadesha. The ash was separated from the altar. Wood was arranged on the pyre, and the excess ash was cleared away. At daybreak, they would spread a linen sheet. That's what we're going to learn now in Masechta Yuma, between the Kohen Gadol and any observer, any spectator. And he would remove his personal clothing, meaning Bigdei Chol, immerse in the mikvah, don the Bigdei Zav, and after Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, he's ready to go on. And now we get to the outer avodah. The Kohen Gadol shechted the tamid. He cut the majority of the windpipe and the food pipe. And somebody else finished the slaughter. The Kohen Gadol quickly caught the blood of the offering in a klishares. In other words, since he doesn't have to finish the shechita, he can immediately occupy himself with Kabbalah Saddam. Then he took the dam, carried it in the mitzvah all the way to the Mizbeach, threw it against the corners of the Mizbeach. Then he went into the Kodesh Kodshim. He burned, no, my mistake. Now he's going into the Heichal, and he's burning the daily morning incense, the Ketores, which is burnt on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. Then he went into, so now before he leaves the Heichal, right? He's already brought the Torahs of the morning on the Mizbeach HaPnimi. And now the next thing he has to do is to be mative the Neros. Right? He doesn't go into detail about Atomas Chamesh Neros and then 2 Neros with the Dam Atom in between. He leaves that all out. Then he returned to the Azara in order to burn the limbs of the Tavid. Again, all this was done on the Mizbeach HaChitzon. And then he brings his Chavita. Remember, we said that a Kohen, every day he works, he has to bring a Korban Chavita, a Minchas Chavita. Then he has to offer a Nisuch Hayayin. So the next thing he has to do is to burn the Eivarim of the Tamid, all this on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, bring his Minchas Chavitim together with the Nisuch Hayayin and the Mincha, and all this accompanied the Tamid. And after that, the Kohen Gadol is now ready to offer his Har and Shiva Kvasim. And just like we said with regard to Korban Tamid, the Kohen Gadol had to slaughter. He needs now to be makabel the dam. He's got to carry the dam of each animal by itself. And later on, he's going to combine the two dam. Okay, we'll stop here. In Mitzvah Shem, we'll continue this tomorrow.